I want to play for you a riff that he did on freedom that I thought was very interesting, talking about freedom in this election and sort of this is something the Harris campaign is really focused on as a kind of an issue they have the upper hand. That word and what it means, of course, using the Beyonce freedom song at all the campaign rallies. Here's ex-President Barack Obama talking about freedom and what it means. Take a listen.
For Donald Trump and his cronies, freedom means that the powerful can do whatever they please. Fire workers for trying to organize a union, dodge paying their fair share of taxes, try to throw out your votes when they lose an election, control what women can and can't do with their bodies. In other words, for Trump, freedom is getting away with stuff.
I thought that was really a powerful line. A lot of things have been said about Donald Trump over these many years, but that I thought cut to the quick. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, and I think it's just reminding people that Trump views himself as someone who is above the fray relative to the average person, which really cuts away at this idea of the faux populism that Trump tries to sell, which is that he's the everyman, just like every other voter who's watching him, which is certainly just not true. And I think Obama not only helps sell that message, but Harris helps sell that message when she's talking about her upbringing and who she is relative to who Donald Trump is. I also don't think it helps that Donald Trump, you know, even though it's not just him, Barron Trump is getting headlines recently, allegedly saying things like, oh, I wasn't fed with a silver spoon, I was fed with a gold spoon. And so I think that people are starting to see this idea of who the Trump family is by way of Barron Trump, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump, and they really know that they're not just the everyman or this faux populist person that he tries to sell himself to be. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of populism in that 2012 Obama campaign, Congresswoman. And you saw it again here about things like tax cuts, things like who Donald Trump is looking out for, who Kamala Harris, trying to bring it really back to there's character, there's a sort of character argument and the kind of meat and potatoes argument. Do you think, does that stuff still matter? Like, sometimes I wonder if our politics have gotten so bizarre and insane that the basics of like who is going to benefit you, he's going to raise your taxes on terrorists $4,000, she wants to give you tax breaks, how much that gets through.
I have the same fear. You know, I think that what's happening is that there's so much information, so much disinformation. We have become so accustomed to lies, right? It's the thing that most people, the number one thing that people think about politicians are that they lie, is that they're dishonest or that they're, you know, hiding one hand. And I think that what the results of that is that people no longer know what to trust when we hear things. So even when you get substantive speeches like this, you know, you start to wonder, well, you know what, are they just talking or is someone actually going to come out and do things? So on the one hand, I think that more than the speeches, more than, you know, the rallies, I think that deep down what Americans want to see, they want to, you know, they want to go outside. They want to see that when they go to the grocery store, that their groceries are less. They want to be able to buy a house. They want to be able to live comfortably, right? Yep. They want their children to be safe, and they want them to be able to go to schools that are well paid, right? That's what people are looking for, and all they kind of are getting is the bickering. They're getting the absurdity. They're getting the circus. So while it benefits the media, it's really served to make discerning what we want and what we are getting out of politics so much harder for everyday people. And we really have to fight back against that instinct of allowing that to be like the normal in our politics.
Yeah, to that point about sort of the nastiness, I'm not going to play the clip, but Alexi, today Trump was in Detroit and said, if Harris is elected, you want to know the truth, it'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit. If she's your president, you're going to have a mess on your hands. Not particularly subtle, but that is basically 100% of that campaign at this point.
He's flailing. I mean, like, his pitch is literally at this point, like, pick the white guy or the black girl. And he's asking people who are the most racist of this country to support him and to actually come out and vote, because that's who he knows he needs to get out to vote in order to win this election. Like, those are his swing voters at the end of the day. And that is what is so alarming about this. And, you know, I thought it was really interesting when former President Obama said basically like, hey, men, male voters, I don't care if you think that women are weak. You need to reconsider what you think about Kamala Harris and really focus on the facts, because this is not a joke. You know, that's how I interpreted what he was saying to male voters in his speech today, because it is incredibly important, because those are not only the folks who are not only not voting, but if they do go out and vote, they are most likely, according to polls, going to vote for someone like Donald Trump because of mis and disinformation and because of sexism, as we know, with the idea that women are just not as strong as men, as leaders, and this idea that even though Donald Trump is clearly suffering cognitive decline and does not have the mental acuity to be president, he is physically fit to some people, but that is not the same as what it takes to be president. So I think that was very interesting.
Yes, I mean, Barack Obama doing a long riff on sort of men who think that he's an example of strength and how sort of wrongheaded, I think, like preposterous that is. He said those words about Detroit in Detroit, we should note, at the Detroit Economic Club, although I've been to the Detroit Economic Club, I think, and a lot of people driving in from outside of Detroit to go to the Detroit Economic Club. Congresswoman Summer Lee and Alexi McCammon, thank you both. Coming up, the new Republican push for increased government spending, how Donald Trump's own disinformation has thrown his party's priorities completely out of whack. Next.
Or diapers. I remember buying diapers. You think Donald Trump ever changed the diaper? Yeah. I almost said that, but I decided I shouldn't say it.
An extraordinary 24 hours in American politics, in which Team Harris has called in two of its most well-known and influential surrogates, former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney and former President Barack Obama, two people once deeply opposed to one another's ideas and politics, but now in the same big tent coalition aligned against the disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president and aspiring autocrat. Last night, Liz Cheney was joined by former Trump aides Cassidy Hutchinson, Alyssa Farah Griffin, and Sarah Matthews, where they discussed their dramatic break with Donald Trump and why they're now backing Kamala Harris. Listen to Liz Cheney.
In this election, a broad coalition, a coalition unlike any that we have seen, certainly in modern American history, has come together to defeat Donald Trump. It is a coalition This is a coalition that may disagree on some things, but we're bound together as we work to elect Vice President Kamala Harris. We are bound together. That deserves definitely applause.
So that event last night, a prelude of sorts to the return of President Barack Obama to the campaign trail, a wildly popular ex-president, the most gifted political messenger of his generation. In just a few hours, he'll deliver remarks in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is just the first of many events President Obama will be holding for Vice President Kamala Harris. It's part of a push by the Harris campaign to galvanize critical parts of the Democratic coalition as early voting begins. Former Obama strategist David Axelrod tells the New York Times this, quote, "You bring in someone like Barack Obama to inspire people, to encourage them to participate, and to set the stakes and urge them to vote. There is no one better." And President Obama's critiques of the ex-president have only grown sharper over the years. Here's the last time we heard from President Obama.
Here's a 78-year-old billionaire who has not stopped whining about his problems since he rode down his golden escalator 9 years ago. It has been a constant stream of gripes and grievances that's actually been getting worse now that he's afraid of losing to Kamala. There's the childish nicknames, the crazy conspiracy theories, this weird obsession with crowd sizes. If we knock on doors, if we make phone calls, if we talk to our friends, if we listen to our neighbors, if we work like we've never worked before, if we hold firm to our convictions, we will elect Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States, and Tim Walz as the next vice president of the United States. We will elect leaders up and down the ballot who will fight for the hopeful, forward-looking America we all believe in. And together, we too will build a country that is more secure and more just, more equal, and more free. So let's get to work. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
With 26 days to go, let's get to work is the message of the day. It's where we start with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former campaign manager for President Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign, Jim Messina's back. Plus, David Jolly's here, former Republican congressman from Florida, now an MSNBC political analyst. And here with me at the table, president of the National Action Network, host of Politics Nation, right here on MSNBC, the Reverend Al Sharpton's here. For all that campaigns sit in rooms and try to figure out, President Obama is the answer to just about every strategic imperative that a winning campaign has in the final days. Just talk about the sort of difference maker that he is.
He's a huge difference maker at several levels. One, he's obviously one of the best, if not the best, orators in politics that we've seen in many years, and an oratory that reaches all segments of the country. He doesn't just speak to one side of America, and he's proven that down through the years over and over again. But I think that the real magic of bringing President Obama out is he will remind people when he walks on stage or when he's covered how he handed the country over to Donald Trump and what Donald Trump did with it. When Barack Obama left the White House, we had a solid economy. We had a standing where if you had a health care like we ended up having, Dr. Fauci and others were empowered. We were moving forward after Barack Obama had inherited a serious economic crisis when he came in 2008 or 2009 when he took office. To remind people, this is what I gave Trump. This is what Trump did with it. Why would you risk giving him that again? So beside his oratory is he physically bears in his body the report card on Donald Trump.
You know, Jim Messina, folks close to the campaign, and I know you're closer than all of us, so you'll know better if I have this wrong, but one of their theories of the race is that if people understand the stakes, that when the stakes are higher and people understand that we're not choosing between ordinary, generic Republican, generic Democrat. We're choosing between the future trajectory of America. What is it? Does it continue to be a democracy? Do we continue to settle our differences at the battle box, or do we continue to condition parts of the country, all of them Republicans, to accept political violence? When the stakes are what those of us who cover this every day understand they are because of what Donald Trump is running on, Vice President Harris is more likely to prevail. There isn't anyone who has put a finer point, and I'm thinking about his convention speech in the sort of the COVID convention of 2020, on the threat to democracy. And I don't think there's anyone that understands the threat that Donald Trump faces like a former president. I wonder what you make both of his star power, but also of his ability to reframe and to do that in an important strategic manner, the stakes of the contest in 26 days.
Yeah, Nicolle, look, Barack Obama really has become the country's chief explainer in chief, the person who wants to explain the moment we're in, the position we are, the stakes. He's the best we have seen in our lifetime, and really trusted by the American voters to say, where are we? Whether you like or don't like Barack Obama, you respect him. To Al's point, you respect what he got done as president. And, there's this silly debate in the Democratic Party about whether you turn out voters or whether you talk to swing voters. If you think about one person who can do both, it's Barack Obama. Both of his campaigns are really about doing both. And if you think about one place where you have to do both, turn out voters and persuade rural voters and exurban voters, it's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so the decision to have him start there is just another masterstroke by the Harris campaign. And he's really the one person who can do both of those things, as well as look at the country, to your smart point, and say, look, we are sitting 26 days away from the most important choice you've had to make. Let me just explain why. And that's a superpower he has that no one else on the world stage has.
And Jim Messina, if you're sitting and looking at a map and you're looking at the polls, where do you send him next? Tell me what this tour would look like in your mind.
Oh, my God. Thank you for asking, Nicolle. I would put him in a bus, and I'd put him all over the Midwest. Whether or not you get that much time from him. But what he's amazing at is both the big speech and then, as Reverend Al knows, the retail campaigning. And I do a bunch of OTRs in small restaurants and bars and just make him around the people, let him have a little fun with it. I guarantee you today he's having a great day. One of the unknown stories of his 2008 campaign is he was adopted by the Rooney family and the Pittsburgh Steelers, and they kind of helped him when no one thought he could win. And I promise you have a very happy Barack Obama campaigning in Pittsburgh today.
Harris is deploying former President Obama in the crucial state of Pennsylvania, a sign of how vital turnout will be there. The campaign is in its highest gear, making this move by unleashing Obama, as the New York Times put it. Obama has not campaigned for Harris out in a speech or in the states since the convention. And this is one of those signs that we will see over these coming days, that we are clearly now in it. We are in the home stretch, and Obama is building on a long political relationship here.
A dear, dear friend of mine, so I want everybody to do right by her. San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris.
I remember being in Iowa, Des Moines. It was really, really cold. Christmas through New Year's, and everybody was there. Us Californians, we didn't really know what to wear, so we just layered. The president we just celebrated his first 100 days, and we couldn't be more proud because it was the most work that any elected president of the United States in recent memory has actually accomplished. Not just talk, but accomplished. From his first days, he did what he promised us he would do, and he has only just begun.
And my friend Kamala Harris, he's chosen an ideal partner who is more than prepared for the job.
We have now, in particular, a nominee in Barack Obama, who is someone who is personally dedicated as a constitutional lawyer to thinking about and caring about making sure that we respect and not butcher the Constitution of the United States.
Michelle and I couldn't be prouder to endorse you and to do everything we can to get you through this election and into the Oval Office.
That's the relationship, the what. Then tonight, I can tell you, is the where. This Obama rally tonight reflects how Harris's aides know this race is very tight. They are putting Obama in a state that is usually do or die for Democrats trying to build a winning electoral college coalition. They have Obama guru David Plouffe in a senior role helping run this campaign. He was just discussing some of these plans with our colleague Nicolle late today. And this Harris state strategy does look shrewd. Now, one might think, well, of course, Obama's aides, veterans, Harris aides, want to put President Obama in a key state. But these are actually strategic calls. Obama cannot be everywhere. And consider that, by contrast, in 2016, the Clinton campaign asked Obama to go to Florida in October, about the same part of the campaign that we're in now. Florida is a state that Clinton later lost by 2 points. They also sent him that month to North Carolina, which They lost by 4. You know where the Clinton campaign never sent Barack Obama? Pennsylvania. And Clinton aides seemed surprised to then lose that key state by about half a point, or a slim 44,000 votes, we checked, which sealed her fate of losing to Trump. So today, Harris is statistically tied with Trump in Pennsylvania and the other key states. Obama's first rally, a singular event for Democrats as they learn the lessons of past cycles, winning and losing, and want to use him and this singular event in the key place of Pennsylvania. Remember, Trump just deployed Elon Musk in that same state, an effort to add a kind of right-wing celebrity excitement to his local ground game. Dems clearly view Obama's return as a motivator, and they are not just kind of tilting at windmills, dreaming about flipping North Carolina. They are putting him in PA tonight because it matters so much. And he has that signature style.
Don't boo, vote. I love you back. I love you back. Together, we will begin the next great chapter in the American story with 3 words that will ring from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. Yes, we can. When you're running for the presidency, then you've got to expect it. And, you know, you've just got to kind of let it. I'm so in love with you.
We are just inside an hour from Obama. We'll find out if we get that Obama or a different Obama or a whole medley of why he is such an effective campaigner. So Harris sending Obama to Pennsylvania is one indicator of the campaign strategy. And if they do win with the blue wall in under a month from now, this will look shrewd. And it will look more careful than some of those 2016 Democratic moves I mentioned. There are also other indicators of this tight race. Harris has clearly improved on Joe Biden's standing from the summer. When she stepped up, the overall ticket has improved. That's a fact that we can measure. But now, even her own Democratic Party leaders also see something of a pullback or a tightening on that improvement. They're eyeing how this blue wall that I'm mentioning, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, are getting tougher. Axios reporting on how there is a view that Harris almost seems stuck or sliding a bit. Now, some of that may just sound like the vibes, and D.C. has so much of that that people call it sometimes the bedwetting or the pundits going on and on. But these sources, I want to tell you, include people who deal in numbers and badly want Kamala Harris to beat Trump. So if you're listening to this and thinking it sounds like hype or vibes, or is it unhelpful to Harris or not, we're just talking in the Axios reporting and some of these other indications about people who are pro-Harris, look at numbers and see this tightening, are worried about how tight the race is, that it is a losable race for her right now. In that same vein, we have longtime Democratic strategist James Carville and what he told us on The Beat just last night.
Only thing I feel is the election's coming November 5th. And I'm scared to death. They need to be sharp. They need to be aggressive. They need to stop answering questions and start asking questions. They're doing all this and sitting down with 60 Minutes and sitting down with Colbert and sitting down with... No matter what, if I come on your show, you're going to ask me the question.
That's true.
If I have a press conference, I get to ask the question.
You'd like to see her do more press conferences?
I'd like her to put more things in play.
Put things in play, be aggressive. That's his view on how to make up some ground. And that includes dealing with voters that Democrats usually need to win in order to take the Electoral College, to have that coalition I mentioned. The New York Times also reporting that black men have been a weak point for Ms. Harris. They're thinking that the vocal support of Obama, the first black president, could help her there in Pennsylvania. Ms. Harris's support among black voters is lower than what Biden received when he won the state in 2020. Again, these are just numbers, measurable. Everything can change. Polls are a rough indicator. I've told you that. But if you're covering a race, we're going to cover the evidence as it comes in. We covered the issues with President Biden. We covered his debate. We're covering what's happening out there with Harris, which is context for the picture you see on your screen in Pittsburgh, where Obama's going to come out there tonight. And you're going to be able to watch it if you keep it on MSNBC. And we're going to find out, will he directly address some of those very points, the constituencies, bringing what are sometimes seen as his voters or his winning coalition towards Harris, addressing what might be the questions about her. She's had a shorter runway than any modern candidate, as we all know from the switch. Meanwhile, Obama, when it comes to warning against the return of Donald Trump, Obama is a leader, a voice, who has had many, many people feel that he knows how to handle any kind of matchup with Trump.
No one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing? Where are Biggie and Tupac? He hasn't shown any interest in doing the work, treating the presidency like a reality show that he can use to get attention. There's the childish nicknames, the crazy conspiracy theories, this weird obsession with crowd sizes.
The obsession with sizes. Where are Biggie and Tupac? This is how Barack Obama does it. He's also hitting on something factual. Trump's rallies have their own problems. I just told you some of the numbers that the Harris campaign is thinking about. Well, you use rallies to build enthusiasm and have people filling the crowds to go back out and carry the message for you in wherever region you go. Look at these empty chairs. Look at these empty rallies for Donald Trump. Ain't a lot of people at some of these things who are going to go spread the message. And that's just the ground game. That's the field strategy, as it's called in campaigns. Then you have the personage of Donald Trump, the attitude, the insecurity. We're talking about character sometimes when we talk about leaders, and it clearly bothers him, which is why he then lies about his own crowds.
And who else can fill up? Only MAGA. But whoever fills big places like this at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? We do a lot of these beautiful rallies, and it's so great. We never have an empty seat, never have.
Fact check, false. They do have empty seats, and a lot of them. So I'm showing you both the excitement and the strategy behind where Obama's headed tonight, trying to hold and build on a blue coalition. I'm also showing you the problems that Trump has, which are legion, and we've covered. Then there's one more piece here right now, which is the Harris campaign trying to also go on offense in some red turf. And they have tried to attract some wobbly Republicans who might be turned off by Trump. I can tell you, also in the crucial state of Pennsylvania, that's where Obama's speaking tonight. Last night, Liz Cheney, who was out on the trail with Harris, did something special, something different with people you may recognize. And this is something that we rarely ever see in national campaigns. Liz Cheney, who was a Republican leader in the House, backing Trump as recently as the last presidential cycle, 2020, campaigning for Harris and bringing along Trump aides, some of whom worked with him through his loss in November of 2020, all the way up through January 6th, and then said, enough is enough. Here's some of what they relayed to those Pennsylvania voters.
A broad coalition, a coalition unlike any that we have seen, certainly in modern American history, has come together to defeat Donald Trump.
The man that you saw on January 6th is the man that he is every day. Don't let him fool you.
I've been telling people that is my sole reasoning, is that it's the Constitution. Donald Trump has shown us that he will not uphold it.
Donald Trump thrives on that division and that fear, and we have to overcome that. And there are so many people in this country who want to overcome that.
Powerful sentiments there. You could recognize some of those individuals who work with Trump. Really telling when somebody says the worst day that he was exposed for, January 6th, is exactly who he is. And that's coming from someone who spent not only part of their career as a Republican, but as an actual Trump aide, seeing him up close, on stage and off, behind the scenes, all of it. It's a big, big decision that everyone's facing. And a lot of it's going down in Pennsylvania, with Obama reemerging tonight.
He is the person of the lowest moral character that I've ever worked for. The man that you saw on January 6th is the man that he is every day. Don't let him fool you.
He had spent, at that point, nearly 5 years, 6 years, convincing good, hardworking American people that they were under siege, that they were under threat. But that day showed, in my view, that he is the threat, that Donald Trump is the threat, that Donald Trump put us under siege.
Republican elected officials, I should say, tend to whitewash the events of that day. In the immediate aftermath, so many people were united and disgusted by his behavior and wanted to turn the page on Donald Trump. And so if you would have told me that all these years later that he would be the Republican candidate for president, I wouldn't believe you.
We have to have two parties that believe in the Constitution. That's not where we are right now.
If there's one image that I hope that my future children, God willing, get to see from this election cycle, it's that political cowardice does not win, and that women with spines of steel, like Ms. Cheney here, are saving our country.
Nothing less than saving our country from the cowardice of men. That display of courage and brutal honesty in a time in our country with so much cowardice and obfuscation really is a stunning thing to behold. That was former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, alongside former Trump aides Sarah Matthews, Alyssa Farah-Griffin, and Cassidy Hutchinson. It was a Harris campaign event last night. They were making the case for Vice President Harris in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, crucial battleground. They were warning us specifically and bluntly about the danger of their party, the Republican Party's nominee, and making the case for all Americans to follow their example and their courage and put partisanship aside in November to vote for Kamala Harris, not just because she's the better choice, but because they would be saving America and saving democracy from the guy they used to work for, Donald Trump. Joining us now, one of those former Trump aides you heard speak last night, former White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews is back on the program. The Rev's here as well. Sarah, let me play a little bit more of what you guys had to say about this process of coming out, speaking out against not just your party, but your boss. Here's Cassidy Hutchinson talking about testifying and being received with compassion. We'll look for that, and we'll play that in a second. But I want to ask you what your experience has been like. We've had a chance to talk to you before, but never. Oh, we have it now. Let me play this for you real quick.
I expected the vitriol from the Trump world. I expected them to come after me. I had once been part of that machine. But what I wasn't sure was going to happen was where I was going to land. Who was going to catch me? It was leaders like Nancy Pelosi, President Biden, Vice President Harris, who showed me out of this period of darkness when I made the decision to step into the light. I knew that I was essentially leaving everything I knew behind, but I had no idea how bright life in the light could be. I'm reminded of how much more there is that unites us than divides us, but Donald Trump thrives on that division and that fear, and we have to overcome that. And there are so many people in this country who want to overcome that.
This is an incredibly powerful and compelling message that if you guys could do this, could step out from under the person you work for and not just say no more, but then campaign for and champion Vice President Kamala Harris, then anything's possible. What did that feel like?
Yeah, as Cassidy mentioned last night, it is a really scary thing to speak out against Donald Trump. He's vicious to his opponents, particularly women, when they speak out against him. And that's why I'm so happy that I have these women by my side. I don't know if I'd have the strength if it wasn't for Liz Cheney setting an example for us. I mean, look, this is a woman who was in Republican leadership, who potentially could have been Speaker of the House right now if she had just stayed the course and kept her mouth shut. But you know what she did? She spoke truth to power. And she is an example for all of us of what it means to put partisanship aside and be a patriot and love your country. And Alyssa Farah Griffin and Cassidy Hutchinson are examples of that as well. And so we've been in this fight together. We understand that there are things that are more important than party, and we want to be able to spread our message. So that's why we took our message to Pennsylvania, battleground state, and wanted to get the word out there that Donald Trump is wholly unfit to ever be president again. And we encourage those that are undecided to cast their vote for Kamala Harris, because even if you disagree with her on policy, which the four of us do, there would definitely be policies we disagree with her on. We all still identify as Republicans. There are things that also matter when casting your ballot, like the Constitution, like character. And so I believe Kamala Harris will make a great president. And so that's why we got our message out there in Pennsylvania yesterday.
You all, especially as communicators, understand the toxic brew that Donald Trump whips up himself and spoon feeds to the base. What's your best advice on how to break through to those people who've been drinking those lies now for 8.5 years?
I think the biggest thing is that you're never going to shame people out of their beliefs. And I think that way back when Hillary Clinton made the comment about basket of deplorables. And I don't know if that's necessarily the right approach. And I think that in her 60 Minutes interview this past Sunday, the vice president was asked about this. And I thought that she had a really good response about how there is more that unites us than divides us. And I think that that message rings true. And so we need to reach out to these people with compassion and understanding. If we want to defeat MAGA, even if Donald Trump loses in November, MAGA isn't going to go away. And so we need to be compassionate. Sure, there are going to be people who are going to be with him no matter what, and you might not ever be able to convince them otherwise. But I do believe that there are those people who are on the fence. They might have voted for him in 2016 and 2020. But they're put off by his character. And we just need to remind them that character matters. And we want our children to look up to their president and it be someone who they're inspired by. And I don't think that anyone out there would want their future children or their current children to grow up and behave like Donald Trump. I certainly wouldn't. I don't have children yet, but hopefully I will one day. And I want them to look up to their leaders and be inspired by them. And Donald Trump displays behavior quite the opposite.
Your fellow colleagues in the West Wing, the men, where are they?
Yeah, it's quite disappointing that it's the women who tend to have the loudest voices when it comes to my former colleagues, and that many of these men are staying on the sidelines. And for me, that just wasn't a risk I was willing to take. I know the threat that Donald Trump poses, and I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't do everything in my power to make sure he never steps foot in the Oval Office again. And so I understand that some of these men might have different calculations. I know that his own vice president, Mike Pence, has refused to endorse him, but won't go as far as saying he's voting for Kamala Harris. And then you have others like John Kelly and Mark Esper who have said what a threat Donald Trump is, but again, aren't taking that next step. And so, I mean, there's still 26 days, but I'm not necessarily holding my breath. But at least for me, I wanted to do everything in my power to make sure that Donald Trump is never president again.